Pozdrav, dragi narode, dobrodošli u još jednu epizodu Slobodni. Današnja tema je tko vlada svijetom. Dakle, tko uistinu stoji iza svih događaja, ko upravlja s njima, a što mi mislimo o tome da neko upravlja sa svjetskim događajima. Danas mi je velika čast ugostiti nekoga koji je to istražio proteklih 10 godina, napravio sjajnih 16, odnosno već više od 17 dokumentaraca u kome u svakom od njih objašnjava jednu od poluga i objašnjava povijest toga nastanka i zato će biti današnji razgovor izuzetno zanimljiv. Moj današnji gost je neovisni novinar, gospodin Derrick Broze. Hello Derrick, welcome to our show in Croatia.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Can you say a few words about your background?
Sure. So as you said, my name is Derrick Broze. I'm originally from the United States, from Texas, and I've been working in independent media as an independent investigative journalist for about 13, 14 years. Started out as an activist in 2009, 2010, started questioning government, policies, corruption, in the United States, and I have dedicated all of my time to expose this corruption with books, with stories, I give presentations, and everything I do is trying to empower the people, question government and authority, and most importantly, to try to focus on solutions.
Yeah, and you investigate a lot, and your research is perfect, and you put it in documentaries, but it's important today to explain. Let's start. Well, who is really running the world? We don't know exactly, but we found you found lots of connections between these groups. Where we can start? From where?
Well, so I wanted to try to answer that question, as you said, who really runs the world? Anybody who has tried to answer this question or gone down these rabbit holes finds all kinds of answers, different claims, the Freemasons, the Jesuits, the Zionists, and lots of different claims, secret societies. And I've read a lot of these things over the years and researched them. But I wanted to create a documentary series that would actually look at just the facts and just at what we can prove, not just the conspiracy theories, but the conspiracy facts. And what can we prove based on government documents or based on factual reporting or based on people's own words and their own testimonies. And that led me to the creation of a 17-part documentary series, The Pyramid of Power. And the idea with it was that we would start to look at these different pieces of the puzzle, starting very basic with the education system. The first episode is the what I call big education, which is just looking at the history of the education system. Obviously, my focus is largely the United States, but this educational model applies all around the world. And we start from education, we look at media, we look at different areas. And the idea with the documentary is that each chapter, each episode, we get a little bit deeper, a little bit further into understanding how these systems and how these people and these groups work together. And by the end of the series, we hope to paint a picture of how there are, in fact, groups, organizations, secret societies, and individuals who control not only the U.S. government, but I'm sure the same forces are involved in the Croatian government and governments across Europe and across Eastern Europe, etc. So yeah, we started with the education system because I think understanding how from the very beginning our minds are molded and shaped at a young age through the education system, I think that's really crucial to understanding the rest of the pieces of the pyramid.
How they took over education?
So in the beginning, you have, before mandatory education, I mean, I look at the history of this and it goes back to, the royal houses of Europe. I think it was 1700 when the first declaration of mandatory education. But it took a couple hundred years for it to become mandatory in most of the world. And in the United States, the education system was largely based on the Prussian model of education, coming from Prussia, of course. And this was done through the Rockefellers and the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller family. They founded what they called the General Education Board. And some of the people involved in founding the modern education system in the United States who worked with the Rockefellers, including a man named Frederick T. Gates, in their own words, they specifically said that they wanted to create an education system that wasn't going to create philosophers and thinkers and really creative people. Instead, they wanted to create an education system that would make it easy to create a population of people who were easily trained, people who could follow orders, people who could, clock in and go to work and, not think too much about the world. That was, in their own words, what they were trying to do with the education system. And the way they did it is through the creation of the General Education Board, putting millions and millions of dollars into this system. And this is, of course, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So millions of dollars was even, more money back then. And it wasn't just the United States. As I said, the Rockefellers and this model, they did the same thing in China. They did the same thing in other countries. And the idea was compulsory, mandatory education from 5 or 6 or 7 years old all the way till 18 years old. And when you think about that time period where you're spending 7 to 8 hours a day in the school, learning through the books that they create, the books that they decide what topics get taught, which history gets taught, which science gets taught, you're in those schools, you're spending more time in those schools with the teachers and with the education that they're promoting than you are with your own family, with your own parents. And also at a time in your life when, as young adults and children, we are very impressionable. We learn things, and when you are taught things at a young age, many times that forms the basis for your knowledge, your foundation, and you carry that knowledge or what you believe is knowledge for the rest of your life, and you take that with you. So there's a lot of power in getting into the minds of the youth at a very young age and trying to enforce and instill your vision of the world, your model of history, your model of science, et cetera, and the view of government and all those kinds of topics. So that is the short version of how they got in and used the education system. And then from the education system, as we look at it in my documentary series, you can see how once you have the minds and the mind is controlled and the mind is influenced and shaped, then it's very easy to influence people through the rest of their lives. Even if somebody never goes to college, never does any other education after high school, secondary school, you've already spent 10 to 12 years of their life putting in the ideas and the thoughts that you want into their own minds. And so it takes a very strong mind and a critically thinking person to be able to question that, to challenge those things that they were taught in the public education system.
And that looks like more like indoctrination than not education. There is a good example of it, how they took over medicine and big pharma. They took it also through education.
Absolutely. We could see the same kind of model and the same strategy used in the medical institutions. And again, we see some of the same players, the Rockefeller family and the Rockefeller institutions. I talk about this in the documentary series as well. There was something called the Flexner Report. There was this gentleman named Abraham Flexner, and he was working with the Rockefellers. And basically, Flexner put out this report that was widely adopted and promoted in the United States and across Europe that basically said that all sort of natural, traditional medicine that people all around the world were doing, you think about indigenous medicine, people using herbs, people using non-pharmaceutical ways to treat themselves. He basically said all of that is quackery. It's all, it's all fake. It's all, just not good. And it's all snake oil and things like that. And basically what they did is they demonized vitamins. They demonized, just healthy living. They demonized herbal medicine, all the sort of things that a lot of us, no matter where you live in the world, most of the people in the world prior to the current modern medical system, and sure, there are some positives to the medical system as it exists today, of course, we can admit that. But Abraham Flexner and the Flexner Report, which was funded by the Rockefellers, when they put this report out, he basically said, if it's not coming through the pharmaceutical industry, which they were helping build with their oil money, then it's bad, it's quackery, and needs to be shut down. And when that report came out, the United States, as well as other parts of the world, went from having all kinds of doctors and traditional healers all over the place who were unlicensed to shutting down so many different doctors and healers and people who are treating themselves with natural medicines. And instead, you started to see the beginning of the current medical institutions where you have to have a license in order to treat people. You have to go through all these different regulations and these different processes in order to be able to treat yourself, in order to treat other people. And as I said, I think there's some things that we probably could say there's a positive development. Medicine got safer in some ways, but for the most part, it really seemed like this was just another way for the Rockefeller family, as well as others they were working with, the Carnegies and other families, to really start to just monopolize the different industries. They came from monopolizing the oil industry, which is where the Rockefellers originally got rich and became millionaires and eventually billionaires. And then from those same chemicals, petrochemicals, they use those chemicals to start developing pharmaceuticals and then to develop the monopolization of the medical industry to push out all traditional medicine, and in the same way to become dominant and control over the education system. And this is a process that continues on until today. I mean, this didn't just happen 100 years ago, 150 years ago, and then, they're not involved anymore. This same control still exists, as we saw, for example, with the medical industry during the COVID years.
Yes, and as you said, for this production, for Big Pharma, they need oil. And before that, they build up oligarchy, you call it in your documentary. How they build this oligarchy and who is behind it?
Well, in the same way, I mean, this is kind of seems to be the model, the strategy that the Rockefeller family used in all industries, which is to attack the competition, to monopolize an industry, whether we're talking about pharmaceuticals, medicals, education, or the oil industry, and then to take control of that, to basically smother any competition. And this goes back to all the way back to one of the original Rockefellers. Wild Bill was his nickname. And he actually was known as a true snake oil salesman. And he, as I said, pushed out his competition. He ends up getting control of some oil companies. And as they grew and as their wealth grew, he pushed out all the other competitors until in the United States, what was called Standard Oil, the Rockefellers company, became the first monopoly, the first historical monopoly, and was able to dominate the entire industry. And even though eventually the Supreme Court of the United States did get involved and they did a ruling and they said Standard Oil is a monopoly and they forced them to break up into smaller companies, those companies that still exist today, like Exxon, Mobil, these other ones, they're still around, and they still, to this day, even though they've been broken up into smaller companies, now 100 years later, they're just as big as, and probably even bigger than they were when they were Standard Oil. And so they really, their power hasn't gone away. And the reason I call it an oligarchy, which I actually did get that phrase from James Corbett, I think one of your previous guests, is because much like the phrase oligarchy, which people understand of being a rule by a few people, by corporations or just a couple of men, in that same way, the oligarchy of the Rockefellers and others, not only did they want to control and dominate the oil and the energy industry, because we can understand how important that is. If you can control the oil, our entire world runs on oil, and whether that's vehicles, flying, transportation, fertilizer. I mean, it's so much, right? If you can get control of that industry, then you can really, in effect, control much of the world. And so in the same way that we might talk about an oligarchy where it's ruled by few or ruled by corporations, once they effectively got control of the oil industry and then became extremely, just insanely wealthy, they were like their own oligarchy using the oil industry. And that continues to today, and particularly in the United States with what's known as the petrodollar, which basically forces the world to deal in US dollars in order to trade and to buy and sell oil. So these people still have power and influence. I think that's one thing that I think is important for people to understand. In my documentary series, I look at a lot of historical events that have taken place in the last 100, 200 years. And some people might say, well, that was 100 years ago. That was 150 years ago. They don't have that kind of power now. They don't have that same kind of influence. But in fact, when you actually study not only what they did in the past, but study how these same families and these same organizations still exist today and are just as influential and are just as capable of lobbying politicians and controlling the political game and essentially funding both sides of elections, whether you're talking about Croatia, the US, or anywhere else. They can use their money and their influence to control, any party they want, political party. It shows you how relevant this history is, that not only did they gain control of the education system, they gained control of the oil industry, they gained control of the medical industry. They're still there. They're still working to control the future of humanity.
Yeah, for that they need additional power. What is very important thing, it's media. They took over media very early, and they are still control mainstream media still today.
Absolutely. The mainstream media is, the corporate media is an extremely important part of the puzzle. And that's also why I think it's the second chapter in my series, because along with the education system, like I said, if you can control people's minds and you can control how the young generations and the next generations are being taught, and instead of teaching them critical thinking, but teach them just to be order followers and to just repeat what they're taught, And then you can also control the media. So when they want to go watch TV, or these days, social media, get on the internet, and they want to look for the truth, then if you can control those outlets and that information, you can control their perception of the world. You can control their perception of reality. And that is another important piece of the puzzle. And I'm not very familiar with Croatia's media landscape, but I imagine it's probably similar to the US in terms of going from being several companies to, over the decades, you get down to just a handful of companies that control all of the major media. And I've seen this in the United States. I've seen it across North America, Canada, Mexico, of course, the Western Europe. And I imagine it's probably the same at most places, where in, let's say, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the early days of television, there was a period where the media landscape was growing, and you might have 3 or 4 different TV stations. So, for example, in the United States, you have CBS, ABC, NBC, things like that. You have a few of these, and you have different news stations and different reporters. And so you would turn on your TV and you would think, well, if I watch these different news channels, I'm going to get 3 different opinions or 3 different views based on their research. But then as you start to understand and study these networks, you realize, well, at the top, a lot of these companies are owned by the same people. So even though they seem like they're different, or they appear to have different opinions, at the end of the day, they're controlled by the same interest, the same powerful interest. And that is giving people the illusion of choice that you can listen to the conservative TV station, or you can listen to the liberal TV station, or you can listen to the central TV station. But when they're all controlled and owned by the same people, and they're all being influenced by the same people, and those same people go out and hang out in groups like the Bilderberg Group, or are in secret societies together, or things like that, then it starts to become very easy to see how, even though, starting with television and again with the internet now, even though you believe you are getting diverse opinions and views, in reality, the information that is being put in front of you was put there on purpose in order to make you think this way or that way or that way. And as I cover in my chapter on the establishment media, there have been huge revelations over the last 50 to 60 years showing that the U.S. intelligence agency, particularly the CIA, the NSA, and other spy agencies, that they were paying journalists literally paying journalists to work in the media, pretend to be a reporter, but in reality, they're being paid by the government, being paid by the spy agencies. And they tell us in the United States that that's over, that it ended, the program ended in the 70s, what's sometimes known as Operation Mockingbird. But I don't think anybody truly believes that. Now, we have, in the age of the internet, you can pick up your own phone and you can scroll on social media and you can listen to whoever you want. Anybody can be the media. That was the whole idea. And that is true in a large extent. But at the same time, now, since less and less people watch TV and more people get their information from their phones and from their computers and from social media, these same agencies, these same intelligence agencies, and these same groups that were controlling television media, they're now trying to control social media. And they do that by controlling the algorithms. And so they have created algorithms where they can say, for example, put your name, and if your name pops up, well, then let's make sure nobody sees that. Or if you talk about a certain topic that they don't want you to see, the algorithm can suppress it. And not only that, but they are actually paying people to pretend to be independent journalists, and this is, somebody might be looking for real information on a topic that's happening in the world, let's say war in Iran or something like that. And they start scrolling through Twitter or Facebook or wherever else, or YouTube, and they find somebody and it looks just like you or me. It's just a regular person reporting the news. But in reality, that person may be working for the intelligence community. That person may have been paid to say certain things. So it's in fact even more difficult, I think, in the age of the internet to be able to discern and determine, am I getting truthful information, or is this person being paid to say this to me right now? Because people have woken up to the fact that, for example, in the United States, the media lied to them about the Iraq war, and they said there was weapons of mass destruction in the early 2000s. People understood that the media lied to them about COVID and COVID-19 and the pandemic and all these sort of things. So many people are waking up and questioning these things, and now they're looking for information on social media. And that's a positive thing, but that doesn't mean that we've gotten away from the same level of control that this pyramid of power has been using for generations through the television and through magazines and through newspapers. Now they're just doing it through social media with algorithms and with paid influencers.
Yeah, that's very important, algorithms, because I had a show just a week ago, and inside I showed that today they're still controlling the narrative, especially when this artificial intelligence coming. And whatever you ask artificial intelligence, they are using sources what are controlled by the same people who are controlling media. You explain everything in this chapter, Big Tech, also in your book, and we're calling them gatekeepers or controlled opposition, however. Let's continue. We need a lot to explain. They are controlling media, of course. Whoever controls energy controls countries. But who controls food controls people. We'll come later to the finance, because who controls finance controlling everything. But now let's start with the food control.
Yeah, so I think it's chapter 8 in my series. I just called it Food as a Weapon because, well, you can look through history and you can look through the history of warfare, and food has always been used as a weapon. I talk about, for one example, when there would be a war, if one tribe would conquer another, they would burn all the food, or they would, destroy all the crops to try to hurt their enemy. It's been a practice throughout humanity's history to use food, and really the lack of food, to withhold food from your enemy as a way to try to make them surrender. And that did not disappear, despite what we are constantly told, that the countries of today are these great Western democracies that believe in freedom of speech and individual liberty and whatever else they pay lip service to. In reality, many of these countries are more than willing to starve out people if it comes down to it. And so in the episode on food as a weapon, I focus on a couple of different areas. One of those is that the food that the vast majority of people, and again, I'm mainly speaking for what my experience is, which is in the United States, but I live in Mexico now, and it's similar, but it's a little different because there are farms everywhere. But in the United States, the majority of the farms in the United States have all been, taken away. Nobody really farms anymore. The farms that do exist in the United States are all genetically engineered crops, genetically modified crops, GMOs, GE. So they're growing genetically engineered corn, they're growing genetically engineered soy, all sorts of products like that. And it is controversial, and some people say that GMOs, genetically engineered foods, are totally fine and safe. But when you actually look into it, as I do in this episode, you can find that there have been studies showing that there are harms associated with genetically engineered foods. And not only that, the genetically engineered foods, because of companies like Monsanto and now Bayer, they use a lot of pesticides, herbicides, and they're spraying all of the crops with what's called Roundup or glyphosate. And so that is extremely toxic to human health. It's extremely toxic to the land, to the soil. So we're dealing with soil depletion, where even if you want to grow your own food, in a lot of places like the United States, the soil doesn't have any nutrients anymore. And so in multiple ways, we can see that there's this attack on the food system. There's pesticides, there's genetically engineered food, there's all kinds of toxic things that certain countries like the United States are allowing to be in the food supply, and then people are drinking and eating them, and not to mention things that they're putting in the water. And so that's one piece of this whole idea of food as a weapon, that they're destroying the healthy food supply. Like, for example, my grandmother is in her mid-80s. She's 86 right now, and she grew up on a farm here in the United States. And when she was growing up, there wasn't a type of food called organic, because all food was organic. It wasn't being sprayed everywhere. There wasn't genetically engineered foods. And then over time, and this is again largely due to the Rockefellers, they called it the Green Revolution, where the Rockefellers started pushing genetically engineered foods, and they claimed that it was going to help save starving people in Africa, save starving people in India. If we could just get everybody on genetically engineered food, we can grow genetically engineered rice. They said it was going to grow faster, bigger, stronger, healthier. None of that is true. None of those promises have turned out to be reality. All it did was increase the spraying of pesticides. It increased the toxicity of genetically engineered foods, and it gave them more control over the food system. And so when they started to introduce the Green Revolution, all of a sudden the traditional food, which we would call organic today, became sprayed and just poisoned. And then now in the last couple of decades, there's this trend where people are saying, hey, maybe all these chemicals are not good. I want organic food. But in reality, organic food is just what the food used to be before they started poisoning it. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece in the episode that I talk about is how Henry Kissinger, who's very famous for being involved in all these agendas, there was a presidential memorandum that he was involved in where they explicitly said that they would use food as a weapon against other countries to try to force them to do what they want. And they explicitly said that they would be willing to use food aid. So say, for example, you want to give food to a country in Africa or something. Henry Kissinger suggested that maybe they should give them the food if they stop having children, if they have what they would call population control, which some of us thinks is a form of eugenics. And so they have clearly, these people, this network, they've clearly understood that they can poison the food, and then they can use food as a weapon to try to bargain to get what they want from other countries. And we see this happening all over the world, including today with the United States and Cuba and other countries, where they will withhold food aid, or even in Gaza and elsewhere where they withhold food because these psychopaths, as I consider them, they understand that food is a weapon, and we all have to eat. No matter what country you're born from, what language you speak, what your skin color is, we all have to eat, right? We all have to eat to survive. And if you can hang food over somebody's head and say, do what we say, or you won't get this food, that's a powerful weapon.
As I already said, who controls energy controls countries, who controls food controls people, but who controls finance controls everybody.
Absolutely. This is another big important piece of the puzzle. And this is why it's so important to understand how the financial system works. And, I think many people, myself included, when we are younger, we don't want to think about the financial system or the economic systems. Even taking an economics class, it sounds boring. It sounds uninteresting. Who cares? Whatever. I just want to spend money. That's all I want to know. I don't need to know how the money system works. I think that is by design, that these people, what I call the predator class, they want the public to be ignorant, to not understand how finances work and how the banks operate and where money comes from and what is it based on, if it's based on anything. That our ignorance is their power. So if they can keep us ignorant and not understanding how the financial system operates, they can continue to rob the people over and over and over. And so on the episode, which I think we called The Banking Cartel and the Future of Money, I give a brief history of banking itself and where banking comes from, as well as what's called fiat currency, which is, fiat is by rule, by decree. It just means when the government says this piece of paper is worth whatever, we, the people, are just supposed to listen. And in the United States, the money used to be, long time ago now, used to be based or backed by gold and maybe backed by silver. And that's been the way money worked, that money was always backed by some type of valuable item, and precious metals is one of them. But over time, the countries like the United States and countries around the world have separated their money, their paper money, from being backed by any real, tangible, valuable goods, whether that's gold, silver, or any other precious metal or anything. And instead, they just say this money is valuable because we, the government, say it is valuable. And so they can create or print money out of thin air. They don't have to have it backed by anything. And this entire system is what creates this debt slavery, what I call debt slavery, where the people are bound by the financial system. You have to use the money. So, for example, in the United States, the dollar bill is the legal currency. You can't just come up with your own currency and start spending it places. That's the only legal currency that all the businesses, big and small, have to accept. So that alone is one way that governments can have a monopoly on everything we have to do. Well, they get to tell us what type of money we can use and where we can use it. And if you use something else, well, they can arrest you and say you were money laundering or you were committing fraud, financial fraud, things like this. And in the United States, the beginning of this system really goes back to the Federal Reserve. But the point that people need to understand is that no matter what country you're from, every country has a central bank, and this central banking system is really the system that allows them to rule over you. So even if economics or finances is boring or it doesn't interest you, all you really need to understand is that as long as they can tell you what money you have to use, and they can decide how much that money is in value, whether it goes up, whether it goes down, and they can take it from you whenever they want, for example, using the banks, then they have control over your entire lives. And that is the world that we are living today, not only in the United States, but all around the world, where the banks, the same banks as well, who robbed not only the American people, but a lot of people around the world during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, millions and billions of people still put their money into those banks and still give them power over their lives. And at the same time, it is very difficult to get away from this system because they've created, again, a monopoly where banks are everywhere. If you want to get a job and you get taxes taken out of your check, that's done before you even get your money. And most places, don't really use cash now. And there is a war on cash right now where they're trying to get rid of cash as well. And the reason they want to do that is because if they can get you putting your money into a bank account, whether it's physical paper money or a digital CBDC, central bank digital currency, or a stable coin, then they can track every single thing that you're doing. They can know where you are at all times. And if you have, let's say, a bad opinion, let's say you speak out against the war, or you talk about this pandemic that you don't believe in or something, and all the money and all the systems are digital, they can turn your account off. And we saw this in many places around the world where people were getting their PayPal account shut down, or getting their bank account shut down, or getting their online account shut down if they had the wrong opinion about COVID-19. And the more integrated and connected these financial systems become, the easier it is for them to control our lives. And so, again, this whole history, it does include people like the Rockefellers. It includes people like the Rothschilds and these banking families that have been working for well over 100 years to try to use their wealth and their relationship with governments to install central banks around the world in order to control financial policy. And then by controlling financial policy, control our very lives.
Let's try to explain who are these people, this oligarchy. You went deep and you went through all these groups. Let's start with one, what are very interesting for me because of one guy, this Trilateral Commission. And the member of this Trilateral Commission was Jeffrey Epstein. What is very interesting, I saw in your documentary all these famous people, well-known people, and him inside. How is this possible?
So the Trilateral Commission is a very interesting group. They're still around today. They were founded in the 1970s by, once again, David Rockefeller, as well as Zbigniew Brzezinski, and some other Americans. I can't remember the name of the third one. They founded it in the 1970s. And the idea was, with talking about trilateral, it was Japan, so to have an Asian influence, the United States, and Europe as well. And they have been one of the main groups, along with groups like the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, the European Council on Foreign Relations, of course, more popular today, the World Economic Forum, these kind of groups. The same groups that they're not elected in government, so they don't sit in the United States government or the Croatian government. They're just outside of the government, but they have an immense power and influence, and they will write papers, white papers, or in their journals, and they'll put out their ideas like they're just talking to themselves, they pretend. But then their ideas very often go from their journals and their little groups and their meetings to become government policy. And this is because many members of the Trilateral Commission, as well as some of these other groups, they work with the government as well, or they work in corporations, or they work in the media, or they work in the universities. And so they're both playing a role where they have their job, but they're also members of the Trilateral Commission, and they use their power and influence to push us towards what the Trilateral Commission has called a new economic order, new international economic order. And it's very interesting because in 2023, at the Trilateral Commission's annual meeting, they themselves said that that was the first year number one of the new international economic order. And yes, people like Jeffrey Epstein have been members of the Trilateral Commission. And it's just another one of these, what we talk about in the documentary, that are called roundtable groups, that really exercise this power and influence. And so one of the ways that the roundtable groups work is you would have, like, you imagine a circle within a circle within a circle. And so you have the outside circle that might be, say, the Trilateral Commission. That's a public group. We know who they are. We know that they exist. They have a website. You can read about them. But we don't really know what they talk about in private. But we can see they have different members, and they have meetings, and they discuss different ideas. That would be the outer ring, the outer circle. But the idea is that inside the group, there is another circle, an inner circle, that is more secretive and less known to the public. And the idea is that within each of those circles, that's where the true understanding, the true mission, the true purpose works. And so within that, let's say the final circle, you have these people who are really trying to control the world, and they communicate their message to the next circle, and then the next circle, and then the next circle, until it gets out to the public, where you have a politician or somebody, a journalist on TV, repeating the same ideas that groups like the Trilateral Commission wanted to be in the public sphere in the first place. And so it allows the real rulers to kind of hide in the shadows and be in the inner circle while their spokespeople, their representatives are the ones out in front. And one of the reasons this is important is because if these spokespeople or these representatives are ever exposed or they get in trouble with the law, let's say that they're a politician or they're a famous person, and people like us start questioning them and asking, well, what is Jeffrey Epstein up to? Or what is this politician up to? Why are they doing this corruption? If that person is ever arrested or they lose their job or the public just stops trusting them, then they can just be replaced by a completely different representative, but the real power stays behind the scenes the entire time.
Can you tell us a few of these groups? They are closely also connected with religions. And that's very important connection because they are ruling with the religion also.
Yes, and this might be one of the most controversial parts of my documentary because I didn't make it to try to offend religious people, but I do think religion is one of the methods of control. I don't think that means you can't believe in a God if you want to, but I do think it's clear that the Vatican, the Catholic Church, Jesuits, smaller Christian churches, and of course, Islam and other religions and other religious institutions, that they are used as a form of control over the mind, and maybe you could even say the spirit or the spiritual world. And I think that this is I kind of put this at one of the final chapters of the pyramid, because I think that if you can control how a person interprets and relates to the idea of God or the afterlife, and you can tell them, the only way you can get to God or get to the afterlife is through us, through our books, through our pastors, through our priests, through our teachers, and you can convince them of that, then you can separate people from God, separate people from the divinity, from the natural world, and you can also use that as a great control over their minds. And I don't think it's a coincidence that many, many churches around the world, again, in all different religious, whether you're talking about Judaism or Christianity or Islam, and I mainly use examples, of course, the United States, because that's where I'm originally from. But many, many of these institutions are also involved in child abuse and have had scandals from the Catholic Church to so many others where they have covered up abuse of children. And I think that is an important piece of the puzzle, too, is that through the religions, not to say every religious person or everybody who believes in God is a child abuser, of course, that's not true. But the people, the child abusers, the pedophiles, these psychos, they can go within these institutions and they can pretend to be, I'm godly, look at me, I'm a saint, I'm a holy man, trust in me. And they can use that to gain power over the most innocent, the children. And unfortunately, they use the cover of God. They use the cover of their religion as a way to protect themselves. And I think that in my research, in my view, religion has been one of the most controlling factors, the piece of this pyramid of power for thousands of years. And it still is today. I mean, I talk about this as well, that there are people in the world today, whether you're talking about Muslim extremists or Christian Zionists or Jewish Zionists, who are trying to bring about what they believe it says in the Bible, the prophecies of the Bible. They're trying to make it a reality. And so, for example, in the United States, you have certain people in the Trump administration and before Trump, but currently with Trump's administration, who are claiming that they're fighting holy wars, that they're, fighting as Christian warriors. And this is extremely dangerous to use the Bible or to use any other alleged holy book as an excuse to commit violence, to commit murder, to commit rape, to commit abuse. To me, it's just one of the many, many layers, but one of the most important layers of this control system.
What is the role of intelligence community? You put some examples there of what they done it, how, and how they knew that some things will happen, and also they make it some things. And that's how they're, as intelligence agencies, rule with the governments.
Yeah, the intelligence agencies are one of the most important and, quite frankly, scariest pieces of this pyramid, because they have so much information on all of us. They know all kinds of information about every single one of us. And that is, whether you live in Croatia, or you live in the United States or Mexico, the U.S. government and other governments have so much information on us. And so, on the episode about the intelligence community, I focused on the U.S. intelligence community, the Russian intelligence, Chinese, Israeli, and I believe, and then the United Kingdom, because really modern intelligence, modern spying started with the British MI6 and MI5 in the UK. And part of that episode is to sort of go through the history of spying, like how did intelligence gathering start? And then also, what have these agencies done? And well, what we come to find out, even if you just focused on the United States, the intelligence community, the spy community, from the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to the FBI, to the NSA, and all the different departments that have been created since 9/11 in the last 25 years, and even well before then, that these intelligence agencies have been involved in overthrowing governments. They've been involved in staging false flag attacks, like we could talk about Operation Gladio and across Europe, and funding terror groups, faking media reports, as I shared earlier with the intelligence community infiltrating the corporate media. They're also, the intelligence communities, the intelligence networks like the CIA are some of the biggest financiers, the biggest donors and investors into social media firms like Facebook, like, all the other big platforms. Most of the big platforms that people use today, big tech platforms, they started with money from the CIA through the CIA's firm, what's called In-Q-Tel. So these agencies, again, I focused on the United States, but we could also talk about Russia. We could talk about China, these other countries. Their intelligence networks are massive. I mean, it's really, I think, even hard for us to grasp and fully understand the amount of information that they have and the amount of power and influence that they have, that they can overthrow governments, they can install puppet leaders, they can manipulate the media, they can manipulate social media, they can manipulate our brains and our bodies. We've learned about MK Ultra and all the different ways that the US government was trying to study and understand mind control, using everything from LSD drugs to radiation to hypnosis. These are only the things that we've learned, that we know publicly. And that's not a lot. I mean, we really don't have any true understanding of how deep these agencies go. But I also talk about the intelligence agencies from Israel, because I think the Israeli intelligence firms are probably the strongest and scariest available today. I mean, you have many of these spies working for Israel. They go to the IDF, and then they go and join the intelligence community like Unit 8200, Unit 81. There's several different departments that are very famous in Israel for their spying and for their intelligence gathering. And then they get trained as a spy, and then they might go start a technology company. And then that technology company is out in the world pretending to just do good, but in reality, they're gathering data on us. They're spying on us. They're learning about us. And as you mentioned earlier, with artificial intelligence and AI, it's only getting easier for them to try to control, to manipulate, and to learn about us. And the other sad fact is as well that because of social media and a lot of people in the world, especially the younger generation, just putting their entire lives on the internet and on social media because maybe they don't understand or even care about privacy, much of the information that the intelligence community has, whether you're saying the US, Russia, China, et cetera, we have given it to them. We have voluntarily given up our information in a lot of ways. Every time people download a new app, a new application, and they say yes to the terms of service without reading it, they're giving up their information, whether that's a private corporation or a government. And so in many ways, we have given up our own privacy, and now it's being used against us by these intelligence agencies.
Yeah, there is one very interesting example. That was this game, Pokemon. And people were playing this Pokemon around his town, and this all information, this recording went to people who now organize this Google map and everything else. That means we send them with pleasure, we send them all this information about our environment. Also, they have now technology, 5G and 6G. 6G is going below skin. It's calling Internet of Things and Internet of Bodies.
Yeah, this is another really important piece of the puzzle, because I think it starts to now get into a focus on what's coming next. What does the future look like, right? And you mentioned 5G and 6G. These are some things I've studied quite a bit. And you talk about the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things, for those who are not familiar with that phrase, it's basically the idea of smart everything. So smartphone, smart car, smart refrigerator, smart, all the appliances, all the devices being connected to the internet, being connected to Wi-Fi. And the more that we surround ourselves with smart technology, the easier it is to spy on us, not to mention the potential of being impacted by the health of electromagnetic frequencies. But this is the world that these psychopaths are building towards. I call it the technocratic state, and they want a world of 5G, 6G, of the Internet of Things, of artificial intelligence, facial recognition cameras all over the place that can see you and watch you and track you, social credit scores that can determine what you're worth based on what you do. And then, of course, we talked earlier about the central bank digital currencies and the control of the financial system, where they can turn your money off if they want, or they can punish you if you donate to the wrong person, or if you say the wrong thing on the internet, they can turn you off and lock you out of society. That is the world that these people are very quickly creating for us right now. And we have to understand that they will use any and all means to get us there. So if they have to tell you there's a pandemic, so we need you to lock down, we need you to start letting us scan your face to see if you're sick, we need to, do whatever, then that's what they're going to say. If they need to tell you, well, because there's a war, now we need to ration fuel, we need to drive less, or because of climate change, we need you to track your carbon credits, or whatever it doesn't matter what narrative, what storyline they use, the goal is the same. They're trying to push us into this completely digital world where there's no privacy and there's no freedom. And if you have an opinion that they don't like, whether that's on the internet or in person, they can punish you by turning off your digital ID, turning off your digital money. And this is not some far off vision of the future. This is happening already right now. And again, please forgive my ignorance, because I don't know a lot about where Croatia is in terms of this. But I know that, for example, I went to visit some friends in Denmark about a year ago. And in Denmark, they already have a digital ID. It's called My ID. And you can't get on the bus without the digital ID. You can't get insurance without the digital ID. You can't rent an apartment or get a house without a digital ID. And this is already happening in India and China and elsewhere. This is happening in different parts of countries around the world. This is not some conspiracy or 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. This is happening right now in countries all around the world, including where I live in Mexico, where Mexico is considered a developing nation. In many ways, it's kind of behind. In the big cities, it's just as modern as any other big city in the world you might think of. But there is also about 3/4 of the country that lives and exists and survives on cash. They don't have cell phones, they don't have credit cards, they don't have bank accounts. But even here, the Mexican government, just this last week, they announced that they're going to try to get rid of cash by the end of this year. They're saying you won't be able to pay for gas anymore with cash. You won't be able to pay for the toll roads with cash anymore, only digital. And right now, a card, you can pay with a card, but you can see how this is one step closer to that direction. And eventually they'll say, no, you don't need the card anymore. You just use your digital ID. You just scan your QR code on your phone. And so my point is, even in a place like Mexico, these kind of plans are rolling out. This is part of Agenda 2030, part of the Great Reset Plan. It is still right here staring us in the face. And all around the world, this is an agenda that people are facing. So I really hope that my Croatian brothers and sisters out there will really start seeing what's happening in front of them and start looking for the signs of this and resisting and pushing back every way you can whenever your government tries to roll these things out.
Unfortunately, in the European Union, it's already decided 2 years ago, in April 2024, that we need to have a digital ID until 2030. And it's a regulation that means that each country needs to take it, and they have some extended period to implement. But for Croatia, it's, I think, 2 or 3 years. That means they decided without us, and they didn't ask anything, ordinary people. And one important thing to say, that you comment smart city, everything smart. People think that this anachron smart means that something is clever. No, that means surveillance, monitoring, analyze, research, technology. But just we think that smart is something clever. We need to spend some time to explain what are the solutions for this, because people, some of them will say, we know all of this, but what we can do as ordinary people.
Absolutely. And thank you for informing me. I was aware that the European Union has been trying to push for digital IDs for a couple of years. And I know that the Schengen nations, they just also are now saying all foreigners coming in have to do face scanning and biometrics in order to travel and stuff like this. So it's a perfect example of how this is happening very quickly. And I do think the solutions are important. The solutions matter more than anything, right? It's important to be informed and to know this, but once you know this, you have to start asking, well, what am I going to do about it? And what I talk about in my work and in the Pyramid of Power, as well as in my book, one of my books I wrote called How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, which is available for free in English. I would love to get it translated to Croatian as soon as possible and reach more people over there as well. What I talk about in my book is what I call exit and build. I personally do not believe that we can stop what's happening with politics and with voting. And I could be wrong. Maybe there are some countries where there's less corruption and maybe you can resist and fight with the political system. But speaking from the United States system is completely controlled. And I know a lot of people around the world believe or believed that Donald Trump was fighting the deep state. But for those of us who are paying attention, we can see that Trump is actually expanding the surveillance state, the technocracy, everything that we're describing here. Trump is expanding 5G. Trump is expanding 6G, expanding AI, and he's working with the technocrats to keep us from being able to stop it. So I don't believe that the solutions are going to come through politics. I think the real answer is for each of us. And again, I know this will be different depending on your country and where you're from, but to try to get as connected in our own local communities and our own neighborhoods as possible, to try to use cash whenever you can, if it's still a possibility, to try to be as least dependent on their systems as possible. Because we saw this during COVID, where some places would say, if you're not wearing a mask, you can't come into the grocery store or to the market and get your food. Or later on, if you're not vaccinated, you can't come into the store to get your food. And this is going to happen again. They might say, if you don't have a digital ID, you can't come into the store. If you don't have enough carbon credits or whatever. That to me shows me why we need to be as least dependent on their systems as possible. If you can, grow as much of your food as possible. Now, I get that that's not easy for everybody. I'm growing some kale and some lettuce in my front yard right now. That's not going to feed me and feed my family, but it's a start. It's a part of the picture, right? And I also try to support local farmers as much as possible and not shop at the big corporate stores. Again, depending on your country and where you're from, this might be easier said than done. But the point is to try to be as free from their systems as possible. I also talk about, if you can, trying to get out of the banking system. We talked about how the financial system is a big part of the control system. So yes, use cash where you can if possible, if still an option. Try not to keep your money in the banking systems, or try to use a small local bank instead of the big banks that work with Jeffrey Epstein and all these other criminals. And if you can, try to learn about alternative currencies. I personally have used cryptocurrency over the years. I don't think Bitcoin is going to save people. And I don't think that all digital currencies are perfect or the solution, the one solution. But there are cryptocurrencies like Monero and another one called Zano, Z-A-N-O, which are private and which are anonymous and which allow people like myself to avoid using the banks, to avoid using the government, to save money and to spend and move money around. It takes some education, it takes some learning, but I think it's worth it. And so the solutions that I promote are not easy. I'm not here to say, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps and we do this and we're going to win and everything's over. Unfortunately, because these psychopaths have had control of all these systems for hundreds of years, it's very difficult to try to get out of their systems. But what I do know is that if we don't try to focus on getting out of their systems and trying to build parallel new systems out of their hands, which I know that there was a really big movement years ago, and I think it still exists in places like the Czech Republic for parallel polis and stuff like that. This history of building parallel systems outside of the government's hands, that to me is the answer. Trying to get out of their systems as much as possible and trying to build new systems while we still have time. Because if we just sit still and we just complain on the internet, or we just keep voting and trying to change it that way, we are eventually going to be locked inside their systems. We're going to be locked inside their matrix, and there will be no way out. They will starve you if you don't comply. They will fire you. They will say you can't travel. They will say you can't drive. And those things are coming. They're absolutely working on these plans. So my solution and my hope, my wish for everybody is to try to think about how you can try to get as free from these systems as possible. And in my book, which you can download for free on my website, I have more ideas in there. And I also have what I call the 45-day exit and build challenge, which goes through money, food, health, technology. And I look at these different areas and say, here's the problem. Here's the solution. Here's the ways you can get off of their big tech systems. Here's the ways you can get out of their banks. Here's the ways you can get more independent when it comes to food. And unfortunately, it's only available in English right now, but I encourage people to check that out if they're interested, because I think we need to be focused on this more than ever. It's important for us to educate and to learn and to get informed. But once you know what's going on, we need to start taking action before it's too late.
Derrick, where people can find your work and your books and your documentaries?
Thank you. My main website is theconsciousresistance.com. That's where my books, videos, podcasts are all there. My documentary series, The Pyramid of Power, is at thepyramidofpower.net. And as I mentioned, right now there's German translation, Spanish, Dutch, Portuguese, and if anybody ever has interest in translating it to Croatian, I would love to work with you and help put that out there, because I'm trying to do what I can to get this information out as far and wide as possible. And as I mentioned, you can download my books, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, and my other books. If you go to theconsciousresistance.com, you can find the books tabs and you can find them all there. So I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Thank you, Derek. You've done a great job.
Thank you very much.
Evo, dragi narode, uistinu vam preporučam, pogledajte dokumentarce, unutra objašnjava detalje. I to ono što je istražio i što je pronašao. Ne zaključuje više od onoga za što ima dokaze. Svi govore o teorijama zavjere, međutim, pitanju su zavjere, a ne teorije. I uistinu ljudi koji sudjeluju u svemu tome su u zavjeri protiv čovječanstva, protiv nas, običnih ljudi, zbog nekog nepoznatog razloga, možda i psihopatskog, a možda samo interesnog. Na to ne mogu jednostavno zaključiti, ali je važno da budete svjesni toga da se to događa ovog trenutka i da postoji infrastruktura putem koje mogu potpuno upravljati sa svim procesima. Mi smo im dozvolili i dali tu infrastrukturu. Sjetimo se da je u nekim izborima prije 10 godina Vladimir Šeks baš na dan izbora rekao i priznao da je došlo do sumraka demokracije, kako je on to nazvao, i da se ne upravlja iz vlada, oni kojih mi izaberemo, saborskih zastupnika koji nas predstavljaju, nego da su to neki gremiji, tako ih je nazvao, koji iza zatvornih vrata donose političke odluke, a onda ih samo dalje reproduciraju putem političara. Da li je to priznanje da je danas naša vlada vodi politiku koju neko drugi određuje, ne znam. Ali vrijeme je da neko to pita. Da na kraju postavimo pitanje, na primjer, sjetimo se prije par mjeseci kada smo veselo dozvolili policiji da nadzire promet dronovima. Jel se sjećate toga? Mislim da je to bio 1.11. Ili čak, ne, 1.10. je bio. A prije toga su taman uveli skeniranje lica na granici. Dakle, kad ulazite u Schengen, u Europsku uniju, morat će vam skenirati lice. U međuvremenu, kao što znate, pokušavaju da ograniče prisutnost na internetu mlađima 15-16, a kako bi otkrili da ste mlađi ili da ste stariji od 16 godina, tako da se morate identificirati. A sad već i na Facebooku postoji skeniranje lica. Zašto im trebaju sve te informacije? Zašto mi dozvoljavamo da se zaštitimo prometom pa puštamo dronove koji mogu gledati što god žele? Ako mogu se uzdići iznad grada, bez dozvole mogu gledati i u vaš prozor, i u vaš stan, i bilo gdje, svakoga na cesti. Nema ograničenja. Ko je postavio to pitanje? Nitko. Samo su rekli to je super jer sad ćemo uhvatiti sve one koji krše prometne znakove ili prolaze kroz žuto, sad ćemo ih kažnjavati. Dakle, ljudi su jednostavno bili koncentrirani na ono što su nam rekli, a nisu bili svjesni toga jer se nisu sjetili, pa čekajte malo, ti dronovi mogu gledati što god žele. Iako imaju skenirano naše lice. Ako su dronovi iznad nas, a mi ne znamo gdje su, što ih spriječava da kontroliraju sve što imaju veze sa nama, pogotovo nakon što budemo imali digitalni ID koji će biti povezan na digitalni novčanik, a digitalni novčanik već sada uvode svim tvrtkama, nedavno su rekli prije dan, dva, to je digitalni novčanik koji će biti obaveza da bi mogli trgovati. Dakle, obaveza da bi mogli trgovati. A obični građani kao to neće morati. Sada obećavaju da Central Bank Digital Currency neće biti programibilan, da to će biti zamjena za gotovinu. Međutim, ono što vam ne kažu jeste da postoji mogućnost da bude programibilan, da postoji mogućnost da bude samo bez gotovine. Pitanje je samo jedne odluke. Evo sad, konkretno, postoje kartice, kreditne kartice, koje vam ograničavaju šta možete kupiti s njima. Sad su nedavno to uveli, slavodobitno rekli, mislim da je pitanju neko ministarstvo. Sad, nijedan član ministarstva da spriječe korupciju neće moći koristiti tu karticu za nešto što nema veze sa službenim troškovima koje on smije trošiti. Šta to znači? To znači da postoji tehnologija koja će ograničavati što smijete kupiti sa svojim novcem ili sa bilo kojim drugim novcem. Dakle, jasno vam govore ovog časa da cijela tehnologija je tu. Da je samo jedan korak do zabrane ili kontrole te tehnologije zbog nekog razloga za kojeg mi ne znamo koji će biti, jer kao što je sam Šeks rekao, ne upravlja se iz Sabora, iz vlade, nego se upravlja iz tih gremija. A ako želite znati ko su ti gremiji, pogledajte dokumentarce gospodina Derricka Brozea, unutra objašnjava, nabraja imena, mnoga od tih imena već sigurno znate, čuli ste za njih, kao što sam danas spomenuo, i ime jednog gospodina koji sad je, čini se, cijeli svijet je zainteresiran za njegove fajlove, ali ih ne mogu vidjeti, redaktirane su, a čini se da su vrlo zanimljiva imena unutar tih dokumenata. Što bi bilo jako važno da vidimo konačno i neka hapšenja, ne ova hapšenja od jednog dana, pa onda vas puste i to zbog nečeg drugog, nego stvarno ozbiljna, jer to su ozbiljna djela, odnosno nedjela ljudi koji su u velikoj moći. Nadam se da vam se svidjela današnja tema i moj današnji gost i uskoro se vidimo u sljedećoj epizodi Slobodni.